I'm going to introduce something about global warming, even though we haven't started global warming in this course yet. But this is related to El Nino and the sea surface temperature pattern in the Pacific. So I'll touch on this and then we'll come back to global warming later on in this chapter. Okay, so this is the global mean surface temperature trend showing anomalies with respect to the with respect to some base period, which is I think 1960 to 1990 or so. And when we started the 20th century, the temperatures, global mean temperatures, were below this base period. So you can see the blue colors here, and these red colors here is where the temperatures jumped up, and then there were ups and downs before we hit the mid 1970s that I mentioned as the time which is recognized either as a regime shift in the climate itself, which would imply a natural variability, or the acceleration of global warming. We don't know exactly yet, but there are evidences from elsewhere in the Sea of Japan that there was some sort of a regime shift in biological activity, for example, and since then such a shift has been found in the monsoons, in the tropical Atlantic, and so on and so forth. Okay. Nonetheless, the point here is that about maybe 10 years ago, a huge debate erupted as to whether the global warming, which had taken off here, had flattened out between about 1999 and 2012 or 2014 or so. 2015 obviously was an El Nino, strong El Nino, and remember that I said during an El Nino there is a mini global warming. So there is already some arguments made that global warming pause, this was called a global warming pause, ended in 2012. But many papers were written arguing whether there was a pause at all. My own conclusion from the data is that there was a little flattening of the warming rates. So this is now showing beyond 2015. This one stopped in 2015. This one is going beyond and showing similar behavior, longer time period in both ends. So here it went into 1880s, and you can still see in the 5-year running mean warming rates that, or anomalies, that there was probably a little bit of flattening here. There have been ups and downs before because this is called a natural variability. For example, if you had a decade with not very strong El Nino activity, we may be contradicting ourselves by saying El Nino may not change if the climatology is allowed to change and so on. Nonetheless, ocean can hide the heat for some decades and release it during other decades through modes of variability which are natural. Natural means not related to human activities. So if you agree that there was some flattening, then the idea was to find the reasons for this flattening, because the CO2 emissions were not reducing. There was no other change in human activities in terms of land use change, urbanization, and so on and so forth. So what caused this? The best hypothesis people have proposed is that the eastern tropical Pacific, okay, this is now showing the warming rates since this over the same period, and there are patterns of warming. The West Pacific has warmed a lot more than the East Pacific here on the equator, and there are warmings on either side along the coast, and so on and so forth. But just focusing on our El Nino region, this paper from my friend Richard Seeger of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory argued that warming has not happened in parts of this eastern Pacific along this coast here and this region. Why is that important? Because remember, this region takes up heat from the atmosphere. So if the ocean continued to take up more heat here, that could explain part of the maybe part of this flattening of the warming trend. Okay, that's the argument made in any case. But this has larger implications. Why? Because if this warms less than here, then the east-west temperature gradient gets stronger, which would make the pressure gradient stronger and would favor the strengthening of the trade winds. And Matt England from Australia has actually written a paper showing that trade winds in fact did strengthen over the last several decades. Okay, so there is some consistency. So the question of whether the East Pacific would warm more or less than the West Pacific under global warming is a debate that's been going on since the 1990s, when a paper that I was involved in argued based on data that the East Pacific in fact has been warming less. And this was called the ocean dynamic thermostat by another friend, Amy Clement, who is at Miami. The idea is that it's the ocean dynamic thermostat because if you add heat fluxes everywhere, ocean responds by increasing the upwelling and strengthening the east-west temperature gradient and increasing the winds and taking up more heat. So it acts as a thermostat to the warming. And remember that if the ocean heat takes up the heat, then the atmospheric warming is modulated. It is diminished, right? So again, remembering that the ocean takes up more than 90% of the excess energy from human activities and the increased greenhouse gases, this is one of the regions where ocean can take up excess heat. So this relation also relates to El Nino, because then the question is whether global warming will look like El Nino or La Nina, right? So here this would look like a La Nina, the trend. But if this warms more than the west, then it would begin to look like an El Nino, right? The teleconnections and so on will not be the same when you look at global warming timescale patterns versus El Nino timescale patterns. But nonetheless, this region remains very critical for understanding how the ocean responds to increased greenhouse gas trapping of outgoing long wave radiation. I wanted to introduce that just because it is somewhat closely related to El Nino, but we will come back to global warming later on in this chapter, and I will mention this again in that context. Okay, global warming pause is a buzzword that was used a lot in the last few decades.